Welcome, everyone. We're really excited today to have an in-person panel discussion, and the topic that we're going to talk about for the next hour is increasing diverse representation in clinical trials. So first, I just wanted to introduce the four speakers who are joining the panel. At the end, we've got Zhang, who is an assistant dean for clinical research at Washington University, the administrative director of the Center for Clinical Studies and the director of clinical research in oncology. Next to her, we have Jessica Mazurski, who's an assistant professor of medicine and works with research in our Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. Next to her, you've already heard from Doug Lindsay, who is the co-chair of the PCORI Rare Disease Advisory Panel and the co-chair of the ICTS and Institute for Public Health Community Advisory Board here at Washington University. And next to him, we have Thomas Kannampallil, who is the assistant professor in the Department of Anesthesia and the Institute for Informatics. So I'm going to ask each of them to eventually give some 5-minute description of their work. But prior to that, I'm going to just put up one slide that gives you a little bit of background for why we're so interested in this topic. This is just information from the FDA. So any of you who've been involved in clinical research, fill out enrollment tables. So people are very interested in making sure that we have diverse representation for research. The data here, this is data from a couple of years ago, 2015 to 2019, just gives overall representation in FDA clinical trials. And some of the numbers you'll see are they're not very inspirational, and they give us a lot of reasons to want to do better. As part of the ICTS, we have been collecting, and prior to the panel, I asked the folks here to give us information about diversity in the clinical trials in their areas. And I do think Washington University is doing a better job. In some areas, there's really really great representation of our community in our clinical trials. But the goal really is to make sure that we're doing this across the board, across every study, at all of our partner institutions and here at Washington University. So with that, I'll have Yi first just give us some background on her work in the area and why diversity is important.
Thank you. Yeah, good morning. No, yeah, it's still morning, right? Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Yeah, as Chris said, my name is Zhang. I'm one of the assistant deans for clinical research at the School of Medicine. I'm sort of the chief operating officer, if you will, for clinical trial operations for the school, at the school. And I have been a clinical research nurse and as well as a healthcare attorney on the regulatory side prior to joining WashU in my role in 2009. And I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, and welcome to Dr. Castro as well for coming back to St. Louis. And so in my work with the Center for Clinical Studies and generally just helping the School of Medicine building a more robust clinical trial workforce and improving the quality and efficiency with which we do conduct clinical trials, I have found that there are lots of challenges starting at the clinical study design stage all the way through the dissemination that prevents us from enrolling a representative percentage of the population in our clinical trials. I think a couple of days ago on my way home, I heard on NPR actually about a snippet about actually WashU research in the Alzheimer's space. And the story said that there are lots of newly approved tests for testing Alzheimer's, the blood-based tests. But because the clinical trials were conducted using largely white population, they have found that those tests are not very useful in African Americans and Black people. So I think it just, again, underscores all of the importance that all of us here are trying to do. So one of the things, a crown jewel, I think, in the institution is our Volunteer for Health Clinical Research Participant Registry. And that registry started in the late 1990s by one of the diabetes researchers. Initially, we did not really put the diversity, the equity components at the top of the priority list. But in the last 10, 20 years, I think we realized, really the last 10 years, I think we realized more and more so, good research, high quality research depends on a diversified patient population, a participant base. So in our current VFA database, which we also have interfaces to Epic, to the MyChart portal, we have about 17,000 research participants, and about 50 of them are either patients or healthcare employees on this campus. And probably the other 50% are the community members. And about 60% of the participant population is white, consider themselves white. Granted, these are self-reported metrics, so we don't really verify what they self-report. And 40% of the entire registrants report themselves as either Black or multiracial or Asian or Latino. So we feel that we are doing better than prior, and certainly better than the slide that Chris showed, but we still have a long way to go. Sorry, I'm taking up more than 5 minutes of your time.
Great, thank you. Jessica?
Great, thank you everyone. Can you hear me as well? I am Jessica Mazurski. I am an assistant professor here in the Bioethics Research Center, and I'm principal investigator of an R01 that's returning research results to healthy older adults at our Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, which is called the ADRC as we begin the acronym SOUP. But I am also here, I work very closely and am filling the shoes of Dr. Joy Balsberry, who is the principal investigator of the Co-Equal Registry. And I am a co-investigator. I work very closely with Joy on that project, as well as other projects aimed at looking at novel strategies to recruit, enroll, and retain under-resourced and underserved communities. But the Co-Equal Registry is the one I want to focus on today. I think it's a perfect illustration of a lot of what we've been talking about today. So Joy just received funding from the National Institute of Aging, about $3.4 million grant to create a registry. And the registry, Co-Equal, stands for creating opportunities to increase health equity and equality for persons at risk of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. Those are also known as ADRDs. And the project really has 3 aims. I just want to quickly tell you what they are. So the first aim involves doing a community needs assessment. We're in the process of gearing up for that. We're going to do a series of brain aging cafes, which are basically listening sessions with members of the community. We'll do about 8 of those with 160 people to just understand what their concerns would be, how they would want a research registry to look, what types of incentives would be appropriate. So that's the first aim, which is really just a community needs assessment. We know, and as you said, Alzheimer's research is one of the many areas where we have a massive discrepancy in recruitment. Almost all the data reflects white populations of high socioeconomic status, yet the burden of disease is greater, particularly among Black and African Americans, and they are under-recruited into research. So the first thing is to understand why and what would make research more appealing. The second aim of the study will be to actually review a national repository of health education materials about Alzheimer's disease to determine if they're culturally appropriate, where they need to be adapted, what our materials look like, and how they should change. And then the third aim, which builds on what we hear in aim 1, what should the registry look like, what should the materials look like, will be to build the registry. And the goal is to recruit 2,000 people within a 100-mile area of Wash U from any historically minoritized community, although many of those people, because of our geographic area, will be Black and African American. Recruit them to a registry, retain them over time, and also connect them to resources at WashU, healthcare resources or other resources that they might need. And that's a project that we're really excited about because it's sort of going to potentially open up a whole new way of recruiting a population that we desperately need to know more about in research. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. Doug, and I'll have you speak on behalf of patients and probably talking more about rare disease and how that fits into recruitment as well.
Yeah, so as co-chair of the Community Advisory Board for the Institute for Clinical and Translational Sciences and Institute for Public Health, we try and bring community needs to researchers' attention and bring research opportunities and researchers' needs to community groups and to the community's attention. When I think of the importance, well, I will get to rare disease, but as far as diversity, when some rare diseases, there's not going to be much diversity because the pool is going to be very small and limited, and maybe limited in who it affects. I mean, if you're not related to someone named Hokenettle, the chances that you have my disease, is very slim, because it was me, my mom, and my aunt, as far as we've been able to tell so far. But, but what we see is research is very specific and very nuanced. And as you move layers away from the author of the paper, you get lower and lower resolution understandings. And so the concern is, in the old days, that this population from this paper may not represent this patient in front of you. But now what we're seeing is, with the power of data, if we get an unrepresentative group, the individuals who comprise that group are completely lost as the resolution is reduced and layers are removed, such that all that ends up is the guidance. And so now you have guidance that comes from somewhere, and comes from powerful sources, and comes from reputable institutions. But if it came from unrepresentative data, then you have guidance, and you're applying it to your patients, and you're finding out that it's not working. And your choice is to turn around and blame a multi-chain nebulous process that got you this and delivered it to your inbox, or the person in front of you for not fitting the model. And let's just say it's 50-50, and 50% of the time they blame the model, and 50% of the time they blame the patients. If it's still unrepresentative data, that's a big problem. And so that's what I see as a big concern now that we're moving into a data era, is that it's no longer an individual clinician looking at a study and being concerned or blaming a patient for not fitting it. It's broad recommendations derived from thousands or millions or from wherever. And then if that data is not representative, we find that insurance and everything else in the process is shaped by, why didn't this patient respond the way they were supposed to? So that's my fear. In terms of a lot of the health equity initiatives that are going on, what I've been doing is I joined PCORI's Rare Disease Advisory Panel. I forgot it was in 5 minutes instead of just talking. So anyway, I joined the panel, and what I realized is it took me 1.5 years to see how I might help this community. And what I realized is that there are all of these people striving for health equity, but because rare disease is not recognized as a disparity population, none of those initiatives incorporate rare disease in their thinking. And so this is the first group that might bubble up from the health equity world and be recognized as a health disparity population. So that's what I'm trying to do, is further awareness that would be a desirable thing. And all the people pushing in this direction would probably love the opportunity to get a better shake for rare disease sufferers too.
Great. Thomas?
I'm Thomas Kannampallil. I'm a faculty in anesthesiology. Can you guys hear me? So initially, I thought of talking about the role of informatics in potentially addressing some of the inequalities in recruitment for digital for trials. But when I just heard you, there's probably another piece to this, which comes from the use of large-scale databases for large-scale data sets for machine learning and AI, and how we're in the process right now, if you look at across the campus, the process of translating some of these models into the point of care. So that, I think, is a major factor. So I came here about 4 years ago, and the question of what is the role of an informaticist has sort of transitioned over several years. I've been asked to fix computers. Can you get me the data? So it's varied significantly, and I have fixed computers for people who've asked me to. So that's yeah, it's not working. I can't log into this. Can you help me get my access back? Right. So the definition of what's the role of an informaticist has evolved. And I think people are seeing the value of this. I think the real change happened potentially during COVID, right? Clinical trials basically were on a standstill. I see several people. I see Dr. Lenz here, who's transitioning from to a trial that required digital recruitment. So this is where I think where we saw a change in practice in terms of recruiting participants for trials. People started to recognize that you could build these relatively simple algorithms with inclusion and exclusion criteria to find patients from the electronic health record, which increased the speed at which the research coordinators could identify patients, call them, recruit them to the study. It helped immensely. It also accidentally created biases into the process, right? What you find in these digital recruitment strategies, we heard you talk about MyChart, right? Like this inherent biases that are incorporated into that. And I want to give you two examples. The first is that the folks who try to recruit through digital mechanisms are what you would call in the 21st century digital natives. The digital natives use these things more than other folks who are in the so if you're trying to recruit people through MyChart's tech usually, or it's broadened now over the past year and a half, but generally if you started in 2020, it was people who were socioeconomically in a higher class, white mostly, and potentially of a younger age, right? So that's an inherent bias. That's evolving now as the institution in itself pushes some of these technologies to a broader community. The second example that I want to give, I do some research with wearable devices, and Chris and others on this group were part of this. All of us program a digital recruitment program with DE Health, with the Volunteers for Health, and because of our involvement with it, we got access to this large, all of us, a workbench which had data. So one of their selling points was that we have 11,000 patients in there with Fitbit data, with sort of a bring your own device model, and we're all excited because this is sort of the first public data set that has such a large group of Fitbit users. So we started digging into it, doing some limited sort of prediction models or analytics. The sort of first thing that struck was that 80% of the bring your own device population was white women over 45 years of age. So any sort of analytical models that you develop and build are going to be within that cohort. So this is of a program that's run by the NIH, which was pushing for the idea of diversity within its recruitment. And we haven't, the other part of this is we haven't even seen the whole genome sequence in the genetic data yet. It's about 250,000 patients in there. I mean, there is a wide variety of patients, but the question is, how unbiased are these samples, and how do we build into our models how to solve some of the biases that are inherent in these? And I want to end with this thing. The role, like I said when I started, right, like the role of an informaticist here is to help build these recruitment strategies and recruitment tools that can not just get, hey, who meets the criteria based on the clinical trials, but also take into account some of these biases inherent in how we can reach and identify these participants to have more trials that are more inclusive and equitable. So I think there is a role to play for informatics. And I'll stop with the last thing, which is the idea of digital, the idea of big data and data science, right? Everybody on this campus, I've talked to probably hundreds of investigators who are interested in building the next machine learning model for their own pet clinical problem. The biases that we introduce in these models are never talked about. Like, who are the patients? How generalizable are the models? The journals have slowly started to ask authors to describe their sample and how generalizable in terms of the sample distribution of racial and ethnic groups. So this is a complex problem, and I do not think that as a data science and an informatics community, we've even thought about how to build these larger models and take into account these bigger populations. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. So we're going to open this up to questions as well. So send your questions through the chat. In the meantime, I have some that we will start with, and we'll have whichever panelists want to comment on them can feel free to. So what are the biggest challenges to increasing participant diversity in your work, or more broadly?
Chris, I'll speak, and just, I should say, Joy and I, who work very closely together, discuss some of these answers. So I'm trying to speak both for myself and also on behalf of Joy. But we've talked a lot about the Alzheimer's specific issues, and there are some real, so Alzheimer's disease research is burdensome and challenging to take part in. You need to come to a specialized academic medical center. You need to have PET scans and lumbar punctures. You need to come back annually. The time at which you can come is between 9 and 5, Monday to Friday. So it the study designs themselves and the study needs, I think, create all kinds of inequities. A lot of people cannot come during that time. We need to go out to the community. We need to be testing them after 5 p.m. We need to be offering other types of incentives, because the other thing is we ask people to take part without actually giving them much back. We often don't even pay them anything, right? So I think we need to Alzheimer's itself is challenged by these things, and some of this equipment just simply isn't available in a local community. So I think that kind of exacerbates disparities. And we need to work better to get research into the community and be more flexible as researchers, I think, in the way in which we design our studies and what we ask. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll add on to Jessica's great answer, Chris. I think that, you know, in one word, I think it's the blind spot that we don't, as researchers, as study team members, administrators, we don't take the community's needs, wants, considerations in the stage when we try to design a question or a study. And that creates all of the blind spots down the road in implementation, whether that's onerous requirements on the part of patients, participants we hadn't thought of, or even in the inclusion exclusion criteria, you know, in an effort to have data sets that are probably more matched in some ways, we exclude perhaps certain, you know, types of patients who are at higher risk with certain comorbidities, and they never get to participate because they're just, it looks very objective because it's in the inclusion exclusion criteria. But I think because of the prior blind spots, we came to the conclusion, this is what we want, without consultation, without going out to community to validate these questions. And it's a feedback loop. You know, when study is completed, when we disseminate results into the community as well, I think this is probably the time to think about what's the next question. The other thing I would add is that, you know, I personally am involved in many industry-sponsored clinical trials, especially in the cancer domain. And cancer is another high disease burden area, space. But our pharmaceutical partners as well, you know, I think they all recognize, the FDA, the NIH, everyone recognize the power in recruiting and the value in recruiting, you know, dollar value probably as well in recruiting a more robust, more well-represented patient base. They also, I think, have going to this just very short-sighted blind spot kind of, you know, mentality without consulting a large constituent base in the study design.
Can I just add, I also think that, especially when we think of digital interventions and digital tools that are used as part of these clinical studies, there's an automatic bias that's incorporated. For example, recently we've been working with developing these Alexa-based tools for, it's an Alexa-based intervention that's being delivered for depression and anxiety called problem-solving therapy, right? So it was designed in such a way that the intervention was going to be delivered on a phone or a mobile device. The problem is that it requires an internet connection that's stable. And a lot of our participants, it's not the we gave the device, we gave the tool, everything was free, they could do it. But the challenges we do not think about that are almost automatic in most of these circumstances, especially with digital interventions, becomes a big problem in doing these basic things. And that's a big hurdle to pass, I think.
So one idea that, I think what you said was very interesting, because we've got, the researcher identifies what they're seeking. And that should be the first round, not the go point. The next step is what we often focus on, is trying to identify the community benefit early in the process so that there is a give and take, but also so that there's a line that says, what's the community benefit when you're filling something out? We ran into this with PCORI, where I said, how could we get more rare disease studies funded? Well, maybe we could approve more of the grants that come in. Okay, well, the approval rate's about the same. Well, wouldn't it be lovely if they could, we get grants that don't fit comparative effectiveness research. And so you say, okay, well, how do you fix that? Well, you could add, have you spoken with a PCORI program officer about your grant? Why or why not? If that were a line, for the people who are seeking the money, desiring to do the research. So, shaping expectations is part of it. And these are things that are actually free. I mean, an additional round of meetings, that help get a study that identifies community benefit and therefore has a draw to the community. I mean, that's the same thing as getting on the highway, compared to not. So some of the changes that could be made are simple and free, but involve a shift in acknowledging that there's something different. And I mean, if you're reading animal studies, you're not usually asking how the rats felt about everything, and so that's just, I think that's part of it, is that recognizing that there are other needs and wants, and that participants would need to be there for a reason, because this is all extra. If you have a family member with Alzheimer's, you have a lot, and extra is a very scary idea, especially because who's going to get what out of it, and so the hurdles it takes. I mean, just think of the last time you filled out a form, got to the bottom, and the CAPTCHA didn't work. And did you do it again and sign up for that conference? Or did you go, you know what, I'm hungry? So the barriers that are in the way can sometimes be the smallest ones.
Yeah.
And then, I don't want to go on for too long, but there's a cultural thing. So in New York City, parking is hard and expensive. And so we will validate your parking is important, because somebody had to come from New Jersey. The Ubers won't cross.
Same
the cabs.
here.
So
Parking
this
is not free.
That's true. But when the MRI is $3,000 and the nurse is chasing me down the hallway to make sure I save $1 on the parking in the garage, it's a little bit frustrating, because it's like no one's chasing me to get that MRI result back to me. But they want to say, so the gesture is the same, but it may be taken across populations, differently. Because parking isn't free in WashU, but it is far easier, at least, than in New York. Like the gesture that it represents in New York is different than here. So sometimes people are like, who's going to help me with the other burdens?
Right.
Thanks for the parking help.
So we have a question from the audience.
So it's a comment, and I'm going to put somebody else on the spot in a moment. So you brought up an incredibly important point. And I think this is really a role for the investigative community when they act as advisors to others who are doing studies. Because a lot of industry studies, the goal is to get a result. And sometimes the studies are incredibly hard for people who come from economic backgrounds that are more challenging, for them to actually participate in the study, not because they don't meet criteria, but because there's hidden costs to multiple visits and so forth. And one of the things that I think we learned of COVID is you don't always have to have the patient come to the medical center. I see Eric sitting close to me, and I think one of the real models that came out of COVID was the study that Eric did with fluvoxamine, where the center, the doctor, nurse coordinator, never met a single patient in person. And so I'd like him to comment on that study and maybe reflect on some of the lessons we could learn on doing clinical trials in a more friendly manner.
We'll pass the mic to Eric Lenz to respond.
I can comment on it. particularly specifically from a WashU School of Medicine perspective, which is that one of the key things that allowed us to do that was a change in the regulatory environment, particularly the IRB and HARPO level, allowing this, which was fairly recent, allowing in particular e-consent, but I think maybe philosophically allowing it as well. And so I think that's a huge, by the way, plus for the school, because I know in my rather odd travels in COVID over the last 2 years, there are a number of similar institutes to ours who people had similar ideas and their institute would not allow it. Aside from that, I think, the field has really changed a lot, because the idea of a fully remote trial just a few years ago, just 1 year prior to COVID, was a real rare exotic bird, and now it's very common. I was just looking in the program announcement for long COVID studies, and they're specifically requesting using e-consent, doing fully remote trials. So I think it's the wave of the future. I think it's great to have a rare disease advocate here, because in particular, I can't think of any other kind of condition that's more conducive to these fully remote trials. If you can recruit from the entire country or the entire world, potentially even, you can go after cures for rare diseases.
Great, thank you. We have one more question down here, but in the meantime, I'm going to ask a question to the panelists. How can we balance placing undue burden on specific populations without unnecessarily excluding them? Any thoughts on that one?
Well, I'll start. Yeah, I can start. I think we have to rethink. So one of the things I'll just say one comment, I think, which is rethinking the incentives and reasons why people would take part in research. I come at this from a sort of ethical stance. And if you think about it from an ethical and regulatory point of view, we think of research as it cannot have benefits. It should not have benefits. It doesn't have personal benefits. Clinical care might have that, but not research. So we're not going to pay you a lot because we don't want to coerce you. And I think we need to rethink that strategy entirely as a kind of a more meta level rethinking of how we make that division, because I think to ask people to do a lot, and we ask people to do a lot, to take part in research and not give them a lot back or anything back, and that might be research results. I actually think we should pay people more. We should pay them for their time and what they give us. That really, we need to shift how we think, and then it might be less burdensome to take part in research if you can shift the way in which what research means and how taking part in it looks for different communities.
I had a question for the panel, wondering about mobile health at WashU, but not the electronic kind. I'm thinking of the good old-fashioned mobile health unit. If that is happening at WashU, and if it's, I know there's a lot of considerations with that. And taking a page from Bill's playbook, I was thinking of Dr. Castro, who has a mobile unit, I believe, for his vaccine trial that he also might want to comment on, and how successful that is. Does that help? What if you do need to draw blood? What if you do need to run tests? Can you bring a mobile unit out to where those people are rather than expect them to come to the medical school, deal with the parking, et cetera? So just curious if the group knows what's going on that front.
Mario, go ahead.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I can add, when I was here many years ago, I was not a proponent for mobile vans, but COVID taught me different. We were approached by the leaders of the Operation Warp Speed in response to the vaccine trials to really go outside our comfort zone. And in Kansas, we have a number of meat packing plants that we're out of our usual comfort zone and going to, because they're now 4 to 6 hours away from our home institute. And how could you get a clinical research coordinator there to stay for 2 years to do a study? Just seems out of possibility. But what we ended up doing was using 2 mobile vans and utilizing those very effectively to do the initial enrollment. And then we switched over to doing televisits for most of the subsequent visits. And the mobile vans, we had 3 exam rooms, we had 2 nurses, a driver, and a completely self-contained lab that you can process specimens on the van and drop it off and ship it from anywhere. Well, in the past, mostly UPS and FedEx went everywhere, but there's been some exceptions for that for the vaccine. But it allowed us to reach populations we had never reached before, which I think was a great asset.
I think that's great, especially I think to reach the rural population that we serve. I think this is a great idea. I want to add also another dimension to the balancing kind of a test we have to do. I think I feel, since I'm not a physician or investigator, but from my vantage point, my observations are, when investigators come up with inclusion-exclusion criteria, either they take a prior protocol someone else did and just cut and paste it, or it was sort of like a gut feeling, or they may have checked with their colleagues about it. I feel that, Thomas, now we have EPIC. I think we should really use the information in the medical record, the clinical data set, to do a feasibility analysis, right? If you exclude people with diabetes, hypertension, who has less ability to do this A, B, C, what do you left? What kind of people do you have left?
Yeah, and that's a really important question. For those investigators who do not use EPIC and a lot of them don't, and rely on their traditional mechanisms of relying on the research coordinator to identify the patients, we have a very robust setup to identify patients for clinical trials based on your inclusion-exclusion criteria. But the points that you made, we never do that, right?
No.
Like there's no sensitivity analysis on what happens if we select these set of patients.
And I'm speaking strictly from increasing diversity perspective.
Correct,
right?
correct.
Yeah.
And I don't know where, I think Jessica was mentioning earlier about what is the benefit of research. We never consider those sort of factors when we select or when we write the queries to select patients for a particular trial. And I do think that there is more that we can contribute in this area, and it primarily comes from, I do think that it has to start with the investigator, but I do think that as an informatics unit in EPIC 1 and at the Institute for Informatics, we can potentially contribute towards better streamlining your queries such that you identify a broader scope of patients, more representative for your trial. I also want to add one other thing about, sort of accidental evidence that comes from accidental insights that you develop from including people who you would typically not involve. I just mentioned about the Alexa-based trial that we just conducted, and it was, a lot of the recruitment was from Chicago. And one interesting thing for that, the finding from that study was that, the potential benefit in reducing depression and anxiety for those patients was greater for those, for minorities and those with a lower digital health literacy. Meaning, for those who were, digital natives, the improvement was limited. But those who did not have any access to care or even the slightest of the advantage that provided by this very limited intervention was significantly more, right? Like, so this is the sort of thing that you typically would not come across otherwise. And just by it was pure chance that we came across that. But these are the kinds of things that you would potentially need to look at when you consider your recruitment groups.
I wanted to mention something about going out with mobile, clinics or something in the communities. So I once had a meal at a small town diner, and I got a surly reception and a small cup of orange juice. And I came back the next day and I got a huge cup of orange juice and a really big pancake, or a stack of waffles to go with it. I would suggest, if you're going to do this, steel yourself to go a series of times, because congratulations, you showed up. We don't know who you are, and I'm going to lay in a robot coffin that makes noise. That's what you brought me, or like you're going to take my blood and mail it where, So I think there's value in committing to a plan that involves showing up enough times to establish some commitment and credibility in the community. And if that's the case, the results the third or fourth time may be dramatically different than the first time you show up.
We have a question from the Q&A. Can someone, maybe Thomas, speak more about interoperability and health research, such as emerging trends, et cetera?
Yeah, so this is a big challenge, right? So if do you mean interoperability across academic medical centers and sites?
I don't know, Thomas. You can interpret that however you want.
I mean, this is probably one of the biggest problems the informatics community is dealing with in terms of interoperability of not just data, but also the tools and techniques that we use. So I'm going to start with two things. So I recently got an NIA award, which is across 3 sites: Pittsburgh, University of Illinois, and WashU. And we're the primary site, and we're trying to recruit patients over 50 years of age with certain clinical conditions. And all 3 sites use Epic, except that they all use different mechanics. So the query that I developed here would need, substantial modifications before it works at, Pittsburgh or at U of I. So, I mean, it should not be the case, but it is. So these are the kinds of things that sort of prohibits investigators to say, I'm just going to do what I usually do and not rely on these tools and techniques, which have 10 different caveats attached to them before I try to recruit. So that's one point. So that's the simplest in terms of identifying patients. The second, right, so I want to build an intervention that's delivered through MyChart, or e-consenting that's delivered through MyChart, or any other sort of electronic means. It doesn't work exactly the same way at WashU versus another site which uses the exact same EHR. So these sort of issues are real, and which sort of prohibits investigators to think of these large-scale studies. We should be able to run a study across 10 Epic sites at least, without having to think about the technological issues that are associated. And the last thing is data. I mean, everybody at WashU that I've interacted with, hey, it's all in a single. The big incentive when we went across Epic across all the sites, where we could get data from across the board without having any sort of restrictions. But that's not always the case. There's lots of restrictions in terms of getting data out of Epic, even across WashU, across the BJC system, right? Except the academic medical center. You can talk about a lot more about getting it if you're a patient at Christian or at Missouri Baptist, but also see a physician here, right? Like the regulatory issues that cover these are considerable. Then there's also the issue of exchanging data with multiple sites. How do you create an infrastructure that you can exchange these across 3 or 4 or 5 sites? So I want to say we're moving ahead with creating common data models and platforms that can help to do this. But I want to caution and say this is still really very early, and probably in the next 5 years or so, we'll be able to run trials across the nation without having to worry about what sort of EHR you use, but we're a little far away.
So can I follow up with that? I mean, we've talked a little bit about the barriers, but what are some of the solutions you may have seen at other institutions that we should be thinking about here? Are there? Yeah, so I can start, and maybe others can chime in. I don't think there is there's an institution that I can point to and say, hey, they should be the gold standard of how we should follow. I mean, everybody has their own internal solution that they think that they work, that works. The one thing I will say, and at the Institute for Informatics, that what we've been trying to do is to be more forward-thinking in terms of the infrastructural solutions that that need to be in place. So we're trying to be a cloud-native solution where everything is in a single cloud, where the data is structured in ways that can be exchanged across institutions. It's an expensive prospect. It's not cheap, and it also requires, and nobody has a clear solution. So
I want to say the steps are tiny at this point, and everybody is moving on their own. And I'd like to think that we're at least ahead of the game in terms of some of the tools that we have in terms of recruitment, in terms of the governance of these processes. I do think that we're way ahead of some of the other institutions that I've interacted with.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wait a second, we'll get the mic up there for you.
We're moving to an opt-out option for all of our patients and across the health systems, which is going to be phenomenal. Duke has done this already and has proactively informed their patients when they register.
And so does Yale
and
and
Yale
the
has as
University
well.
of California system.
So I welcome this because eventually this will mean things like the registry may not be necessary because patients could be contacted and have a relationship with the health system that we have as well. And I think it will help us in terms of diversity. I think our master database of people that are in our health record is much more diverse than our equivalent of Volunteer for Health.
Right.
And so I think it helps us address a lot of the inequity issues ultimately if people have they have to be actively to opt out of participating in clinical research. And I'd welcome your input from a patient perspective as well, Jeff.
Can you comment, isn't that effectively what's already happening here? If a patient fits a particular criteria?
Right. I think we are allowed with the most recent negotiations with our hospital system, we're allowed to reach out for recruitment purposes to the patients who have had at least one encounter in the last 12 months with a WashU provider. So it's not the opt-out that Mario is talking about, and it's not the same as what Yale has done, Duke has done. I think I want to steal what Jessica said about a meta solution. This thing needs a meta solution. And I think either an opt-in or an opt-out, the system-wide solution would tremendously help with increasing the diversity and representation in clinical research from the initial feasibility as well as recruitment perspective. But I also think the messaging to our community, to our patients, to the communities that we serve, I think should be a consistent one. Just like, I think it's a bit paternalistic to think that they would not want to be part of this, because we always said HIPAA, privacy, every time you go somewhere, they give you a HIPAA piece of paper, so everybody has been sort of conditioned to think, you should not call me if I don't know you, right? But I think we should have a counter messaging campaign to say, we are an academic medical center. We're here to help you to improve your health, and we need your help.
Can I just add, I mean, this opt-in mechanism of the 12 months, that discussion started the time I came here,
Yes,
right? Like
that's a 5-year result.
Correct, right? The confusion about who is a patient at WashU, the definition of what a patient is took 5 years to resolve. Is it okay if you see a patient at physician at Missouri Baptist and get your labs here? Are you a patient here? Is that in the last 6 months? Is that in the last 12 months, 2 years? So that definition, the determination of that definition took longer time than actually implementing how to find that patient. The actual solution is easy, but I want to say the regulatory considerations around who's your patient is, and I still think that this 12-month rule is very tricky, right? Like
it's not easy to implement.
It's not easy to determine what that opt-in clause is.
But as a patient and a community member, the thing that people will always need to remember is that you are WashU.
Right.
They
Right,
don't know anything about the
else.
Night Center. They don't know anything about the ICTS. You are the institution. And if you leave a bad taste in somebody's mouth, it is the thing that shows up on the rankings, the thing that shows up in Marble, not the guy or lady that was curt on the phone. And so that is why one might be able to spend oodles of time defining a definition so that you're not calling people and saying the ghouls are after my data. They're,
Yeah.
so we, and then the other thing for clinical research to remember is that we are in a very precarious time as just digital citizens living our lives, because our data capitalist friends on the West Coast call what they do research. And so 80% of the apps on your phone report to Google or Facebook, and not about what you use them for, but about everything. Like Shoshana Zuboff, I guess she has called it the war for the future tense. Like, do we have access to our future based on what is shaped by these things? So research has a lot of past negative connotations, but there are also digital savvy people on the rise who have a wariness that comes from being part of lists. And there aren't that many chances to opt out of a list because everyone else is not asking, they're just doing. And so if you are, again, as a citizen, you have rights. As a patient, you have rights. As a user, you have no rights. And so that is a world that medicine would be better served, as would a lot of things, if this world were to get a bit of reining in. And they're not going to do it on their own, because that's where the billions come from.
There's a question here, I think.
Mhm.
So it obviously recruiting diverse patients into clinical trials is an ethical issue, I think. And yet I've been on the IRB for 4 years. So I've attended, I don't know, 50 meetings. I have never seen a plan in someone's protocol. This is how I'm going to make sure that I recruit diverse patients. And then when we see the continuing reviews, we see how many patients they've gotten, but we never see anything about the diversity. So is there something that other places are doing in their IRBs, or like, is there something we should be doing in our IRBs that this is something that's included?
I think that's a really great comment. I don't know if anyone here has experience, but obviously our own experience here doesn't require that information, but it would seem really helpful.
Yeah, and one thing I would add, I say this a lot, ethically, I think the question of the lack of diversity in clinical trials and in research, I really think that's a matter of justice. It is unjust that people don't have access to research itself, and as a result, our results don't generalize to them, and that is a real injustice. And I think the obligation is on us as investigators and institutions to make sure we're not blaming communities, but to recognize that it is our obligation to find ways to increase. So I don't know of any IRBs that do that, but it's a really interesting question. The NIH makes you do it, but IRBs don't. And so maybe that's something we should think about.
So I just want to comment, because I think this is a critically important question. And for investigators who are thinking, and Jessica just pointed this out, for investigators who are thinking about getting NIH funding for clinical research and clinical trials, the NIH already asks you to put in a recruitment plan, but it really hasn't had much teeth, because it hasn't been really part of the review criteria when it goes to study section as to whether this is really going to be, people haven't had their research rejected on that basis. But one of the consequences of what happened with COVID and the increasing recognition at an NIH level around equity in research is that the NIH is having very serious discussions across the institute about how to beef up this. And one of the things that I think will come out of it is much more attention being paid to recruitment of diverse populations. And if you don't have a plan that study section believes is reasonable, your grant won't get funded.
I'll just ask a follow-up question. What kind of metrics should we be using to measure our success in engaging different populations and communities? Other than the enrollment table. I think we all.
I think I'll say from an informatics perspective, what we've done previously is basically whatever the inclusion criteria that investigators decide that they want is what we deliver. But I think if there is a push towards, or at least some sort of incentivizing for investigators to recruit more diverse samples, I mean, it's easy for us to align to that. It's really easy. The question is, are investigators incentivized to do that? And what is from an institutional standpoint, what are we doing to do that? I think that would change the game completely, because it's easy to identify these. It's not, let me not say easy. It's not difficult to identify communities and groups from these queries that we're building.
So this was the incentives angle, and that in my hokey answer, or that maybe is, you know, promoting people or elevating people or pushing people forward who have a helping heart and spirit. I mean, this is something that matters to some people and less to others, I guess. You know, but you know, I was heartened to find in a lot of the things I did is that I had some tough encounters with doctors. But when I would get with David Robertson, you know, director of clinical research at Vanderbilt, or you know, whoever, I found that a lot of the people who had the best jobs in medicine really were, quite frankly, some of the best people. And that was really lovely to see. But if the incentives are aligned against, you know, the heart, you know, I mean, we find, I have a rare research dad friend of mine who is not in a position to have his lab research his daughter, and he is researching diabetes like many people, because that's how he can keep his job in the lab and the rest of it going while he spends his off hours helping in this. So there's a lot of different, you know, if the incentives are aligned against something, then that's a big problem. And if they're aligned for it, hopefully, you know, people making progress will be emulated or at least celebrated.
Yeah, I think from an NIH trial recruitment perspective, you're trying to meet the numbers, right? So what is your incentive? Your incentive is, I need to recruit 200 people in the next 18 months. And if I'm going to these subgroups and sub-communities, then my trial's on a hold. And that means that I can't write my paper, I can't write my next grant. So that, you know, from an institutional standpoint, there is no incentive for an investigator to go along those tracks, I think.
And that's right. Does your kid sell Girl Scout cookies to the people that you know, or are they branching out to new communities because they might like cookies too? And so if ease is a factor that influences success, then that becomes really important.
I mean, it certainly is, right? Like from a practical standpoint, I think. And as a junior investigator, I struggle with this all the time, right? Like I need to get my trial completed.
And I think depending on the disease area, the space, you know, whichever the clinical trial is in, say it's in COVID, it's an equal opportunity disease, right? So your results, the number of participants you recruited, you know, the racial profile should match the general community that you serve. But if it's a rare disease, you know, that's only happening in Caucasian women over age 45, then, you know, I think it would be fine to see that I'm successful because I've only recruited Caucasian women over age 5.
The one thing I'd add, Chris, sorry, is just that Joy and I talked a little bit about, these might seem like secondary ways of measuring success, but some ways might be, does your governance or community advisory board still exist and provide input after the study has ended? How diverse is your workforce? Because actually that is related to your ability to recruit. How much of your NIH funding or what in your funding portfolio is devoted to health equity research? Like those are some kind of indirect ways, I think, of also measuring what the impact of an institution might be on recruitment. Yeah.
Another question, you know, what other kind of infrastructure can things like the ICTS do to help improve diverse recruitment? There are things we're not doing that we should be doing in the future.
I'll start here. I think that, you know, going back on the opt-in or opt-out discussion, I think the ICTS could provide that leadership push to continue the system-wide discussion.
100% support that, right? Like if we have a system-wide IRB across all hospitals in the BJC system, that actually changes the dynamic. That does change the dynamics of how we can do research.
And probably even larger national efforts to make that more broad across all, as a standard across all hospital systems and healthcare systems would be helpful for multi-center trials where you're trying to do something similarly.
I mean, I'm just going back to sort of what Thomas and Doug were saying. I think, our ICTS actually has a lot of great resources. I think sometimes they're underutilized, but part of that is I think that either investigators don't know or they don't have time, and you need the time. It takes time. The co-equal registry is an example of the resources. It's a resource intensive endeavor to do this and do it well. And so I think there are a lot of resources, they're just not used. And I think some of that is practical. Yeah.
We have one other question in the Q&A. How can academia partner with industry to extend reach to participants and to share in strategic approach between academia and industry? For example, Walmart was recently featured in Forbes magazine as having the potential to become the largest primary care provider in the US.
Well, I'll fumble with this one while everyone else gathers.
Thank you.
So I gave a speech in this very room to Slalom, and some of the slides towards the end were contrasting the business ethic with the medical ethic and how little it takes to create mistrust, because your job is to get a good shake for your company or your shareholders or something, and a physician's job is to engage in a clinical encounter with someone of diminished health and use your special skills for their benefit. So I've always known that doctors' offices staffs are guarding the doctors because the doctors have to be more giving than average, more giving than than someone in insurance or car insurance, let's say. So the other thing is, I remember a friend whose company was working with Walmart, and somehow they told him to use one fewer screw in the thing to cut prices, to cut cost of production so that they could cut prices on the shelf. I would suggest that creates the kind of friction that would scare people as becoming the largest primary care provider rather than an option, because Amazon will just fly a doctor screen to your front door as well. I mean, we don't know what's coming, but boy, oh boy, I'll let the
Amazon
hopefully
tried.
Yes.
Amazon and JP Morgan,
Yes,
they
yeah,
tried and they gave up.
Yes, yeah, because again, like a lot of the things in the digital world, you can build it and it can work in its confined space, whether that space is your phone. But when you move into the real world with human beings and Mother Nature, because you can't convince someone that their disease is fixed if it isn't, you run into serious inability to budge behavioral systems and nature. And it's much easier to invent a new way to pretend mortgages are tradable, like playing cards, than it is to do that.
Great. Well, with that, obviously healthcare is shifting in a lot of different ways. You've heard about some of the ICTS resources. We will work to continue to be there for these new challenges in healthcare. With that, I'll thank the panelists for a really engaging discussion, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So I will be brief and thank everybody. This has really been a tremendous morning. I think the diversity that you saw and heard in terms of the thinking around how to improve clinical research, translational research, and really bring impact to the people who ultimately fund most of the research. I think one of the things sometimes people forget that research in this country is predominantly funded by the taxpayer, and therefore it should ultimately be beneficial to those people who are funding it. And I think this morning was a great example of people's thinking around that, using that lens to think more about the value and ultimate impact of what we do. I particularly want to thank our speakers. I want to thank Mario, who I think is still here. for coming in person, but Ebony Bulwer and Becky Jackson for their great contributions. I want to thank all of the panelists for this session. I particularly want to thank Doug for not only his wonderful virtuoso presentation, but also remaining and participating in the panel and really giving us great insights. Please visit the ICTS website. There are lots and lots of resources. And as Jessica said, one of the things we feel is that they are underutilized, and more people using them is not a bad sign. It's a good sign. I want to thank some of the people who really helped put this together, my colleagues in the leadership, but I particularly want to thank our communications team, Leslie and McKinsey, for the work they did behind the scenes. And I want to thank Chris Buckle and Emily Hickner for making sure that things actually happened, both in the preparation and in the execution of this morning. And to everybody else, and if I've left you out, I apologize, but thanks for participating, thanks for coming. And for those of you who are here, there are box lunches available. Unfortunately, we cannot provide lunches for those of you on Zoom. Thanks very much.